Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for your kind hospitality since I've been here. I'm very honoured to be invited to speak at this important meeting where we're considering the impact of patterns of social violence on women's and men's lives, the ways patterns of violence are institutionalised and systematised, and the important matter of how women in particular can organise and exert the political power they have in order to break the structures and transform the systems. In this address, I want to consider some of the ways in which social science research intersects and interacts with political thinking and action. The significance of violence against women as such needs no emphasis in this forum. It determines how boys and girls develop. It regulates our conduct as sexed beings, as men, as women, and it interacts with unequal distributions of benefits and burdens between the two sexes. It needs no emphasis here, but that's not to say that it needs no emphasis in universities and research centres in general, in social and political institutions like law and medicine, and in the agencies of government at the state, city and global levels. The last few decades have seen widespread acceptance of the insights that rape as a weapon of war, first, really is a weapon of war, and second, that it is not just any ordinary weapon. There's also been wide acceptance throughout societies and states that sexual harassment at work is serious, first because of its pervasive psychological and emotional effects on recipients and on perpetrators. Second, because the joke or the flirtation is underpinned by and is liable to turn into aggression or assault. It's recognised by scientists, by lawyers, by policymakers, governors and managers that domestic violence is a public health issue. All of these, in turn, impact on our understanding of the complexities of rape and sexual assault as criminal. All of these underline how sex and gender and the enforcement of particular standards of sexual conduct are matters of the first political and legal, as well as cultural and social importance. But legal and policy responses to all of these as crimes, as torts, are unsatisfactory. We can venture to say that that is so in all states of the developing and developed regions. Administrative and governmental responses to injustice, oppression and exploitation based on gender power relations are patchy. Cultural norms are confused. Above all, there are entrenched interests which seek to justify established normative patterns of inequality, and even to justify established patterns of violence. As thinkers, as researchers, as political activists, we have to acknowledge that the relationships between sex, gender, and violence are theoretically complex and subtle. On the one hand, it's all very easy. Forms of violence are evils, which should be eradicated and against which we must campaign. On the other hand, it's all very difficult. The forms of violence that have long concerned feminists, sexual assault, rape and murder, domestic abuse, aren't confined to interactions between men and women, even if, as is invariably the case, the vast majority of perpetrators are men, and the majority of sufferers are women. The complication of the relationships between biological sex and society are addressed by and in the theoretical concept gender. This captures the social complexity and the variability in the expression of sex, male, female, in the various masculinities and femininities that are lived in societies. Power, authority, norms impact differentially and fatefully upon men and upon women, of that there is no doubt. Inequalities and injustice in relations between the sexes have prompted feminist politics, led by women, as women, in many social contexts and many historical periods. But the categories male and female, men and women, are inadequate sociologically and philosophically when we come to understand and to explain the mechanisms, the systematic workings that underlie the phenomena we experience. They're even inadequate in many contexts to our experience of the phenomena. In this talk, I'm going to discuss first how sociological analysis, if it is to be phenomenologically and explanatorily adequate, always requires social theory, philosophy. In particular, we can't analyse sexual inequalities without analysing gender norms. Second, I'm going to discuss how this social theory interacts with politics, with feminist politics in particular. And that, third, turns our attention to questions of political ethics in relation to political power. In thinking about political power, including the power to change social norms and reconfigure social structures and relationships, we have to think, of course, about political violence and about the possibility and the nature of a non-violent politics. Research in the field of gender and violence has been exceptionally informative when it has focused on the sociological relationships between male and female, income and wealth, health and employment, political participation and influence, legal rights and cultural norms. Distributions of benefits and burdens between men and women are systematically connected to different relationships to forms of violence. Men and women perpetrate different forms of violence on different victims, and they are rewarded and punished differentially for so doing. In particular, violence by men against women in the form of domestic abuse, familial and social rape and sexual assault, organised forced prostitution, and the threatened violence that underlies social harassment in public settings is correlated with the inequalities between the sexes of income and welfare, political power, and cultural authority. Forms and rates of gender violence correlate also with the other great sociological structures of class and status. Sociologically, researchers are concerned to quantify the incidence of different forms of violence, to analyse the correlations, to consider the matter of cause and effect with a view to evaluating possible policy and political interventions. That political and sociological research programme is not possible, though, without careful and subtle inquiry into the meanings of and the contestations over violence in relevant contexts. How are the blows, the uses of weapons against the body understood and valued by perpetrators, by recipients, and by their audiences? Are they understood as violence as such, or are they interpreted in terms of other interpersonal transactions, like dessert or fun or a joke? What emotions are engaged in experiencing, and if we interview people, in remembering them? Are they understood as good, as bad, as neutral? In particular, are these meanings clear, or are they ambiguous? Are reporters certain or sure of their experience, or are they ambivalent? I'm posing all of these as questions because one thing only is sure, and that one thing is that meanings of violence are variable. From setting to setting, often they are contested or ambiguous. Now, emphasising that variability and ambiguity is quite consistent, I insist, with emphasising harms and the negative effects of practices of intimate partner assault, rape in war or in civil society, coercion into marriage, childbearing, or particular occupations. We can be aware of ambiguity and contestation and the fact that different parties to violent relationships have different accounts, and hold on to our normative understanding of the harms of particular violent practices. Meanings and understandings themselves are norms, of course. Correctness in grammar, the appropriateness of metaphors or descriptions, adjectives, the rightness of our descriptions of events are themselves matters of convention. Norms both describe appropriate or correct language or conduct, and they also explain it. The norms governing sex and gendered conduct, norms of femininity and masculinity in a setting, are key factors in the explanation of rates of violence. Many political traditions, but perhaps feminism in particular, focus on norms as both a necessary factor in the explanation of structures and systemic stability, and as a critical political mechanism for social transformation. Of course, what counts as normal, right, good in any context, follows from, is related to, the material distributions of wealth, productive capitals, and exchangeable currencies. But how might those material goods be redistributed? Not directly by force, nor straightforwardly by legislation. The norms have to change before the force can be effective, or before legislation can become possible, let alone implemented, as we were discussing earlier. Challenging what counts as normal, arguing for new standards, is both a strategy of action in feminist politics and a proper mechanism for reconstruction. Theoretically, feminism is concerned with norms on several levels. Given male and female social sex roles, how are privileges and burdens distributed between men and women? What norms and standards govern and justify these standards? That's the first level. But second, gender itself comprises a grammar. We think of gender not as a thing, but as a series of rules that govern behaviour and order. Critically, we argue that behaviour is not fixed, the rules are not immutable. A system of grammar, as in natural languages like English or Georgian, can change. Feminism, the politics that seeks to transform the system of gender-related violence, seeks to change gender itself, seeks to change the norms that regulate the conduct of men and women. Third, norms, rules, anyway, change all the time. Invisible and empirical processes of subversion, innovation, diffusion, establishment, and enforcement. It's important to understand the deep negotiability of norms and standards. They are always contestable, always therefore ambiguous, never wholly certain. There are gaps, sometimes chasms, between the norms endorsed in state law and those embodied and lived in society and by social groups. There are gaps between people's understandings and articulations of norms and their actual conduct. There are clashes between the norms endorsed by different social groups. There are divergences between dominant cultures and subcultures, between those who enjoy conformity to the social standard and those who dissent or deviate from it. The justifiability of norms is a matter of philosophy and of political ethics. The gap between law and norm and practice, is a matter for social analysis and for political action. Feminist theory and politics has always critically analysed the norms that govern the conduct and the uses of violence in societies. The idea of a continuum of violences has been significant in feminist thought since the 18th century, at least. The continuum runs through several domains. Certain patterns and practices of violence are pursued, enjoined, or tolerated by states. Practices and norms of violence pervade society and culture. Within interpersonal and intimate relationships of kinship, friendship and family, finally, physical and psychological forms of violence are significant. Feminist theory looks at the threads that maintain all of these as a coherent system and finds gender running through them in complex ways. First, all these forms of violence both contribute to and draw upon the gender system. So, military training, for example, invariably draws on and deploys ideologies of gender in motivating and disciplining soldiers. Where women serve or even are conscripted alongside men, as occurs from time to time, the negotiation with the normative gender system becomes very complicated. However, the basic structural equation of masculinity with aggression and violence, and femininity with weakness, with that which must be protected, is always sustained. And so also is the ambivalent attitude to femininity. It's both that which must be protected, and it's also that which is denigrated and held in contempt. It's that which every soldier is told he or she must not be. Second, feminist analysis shows how ubiquitous this basic structure is. The identification of weapons with phallus, the effeminacy, the rapeability of the enemy. Third, feminist analysis also links this basic structure, this basic ambivalence, to patterns of violence in culture and society, whatever they are. Fights in and around pubs, inter-club violence around football, subcultures like bikers or skinheads, the civilised and sporting pastimes of the rich. In all these forms, masculine and feminine conduct tend to be highly normalised, even, perhaps particularly, where the norms of a previous generation or of rival lifestyles and cultures are being challenged and overturned. And we must mention here the violence of police and civil authorities, where society meets state on a daily basis in constitutional settings, and where frequently conduct of police and conduct of those who oppose them reflect and refract one another. Research invariably reveals gender discourse and practices bound up with the uses of force. In the tensions of gender norms, and in the context of this deep tie between state, society, and embodied individuals, all violence, and in particular familial and intimate partner violence, will be understood and rationalised and practised in distinctive ways. The identification and the study of these continua and connections serve to politicise violence in a way that can't occur if domestic violence, war, forms of social violence are understood as separate from each other, separately intelligible, explicable phenomena, each to be understood and tackled in its own terms. For gender norms, ambivalently understood and enforced, run across these forms of violence and indeed lend them intelligibility. So the politics here is that tackling social violence in gangs, for instance, or opposing state violence in prisons, say, or attempting to diminish the incidence of rape in marriage can hardly be thought of without thinking about norms of masculinity and femininity and the tensions and relationships between them. And that involves redistributing goods, status, authority, right, as well as material things like income, between the groups, men and women. This kind of redistribution can, and does of course, occur by natural, accidental, historical means. But where a need for it to happen is identified, where there are groups who stand to gain and lose, more or less, by its coming about, and where social and state power, as well as individual bargaining and exchange, are identified as strategically important to bringing about the change, there we have a political situation. So we speak of the politicisation of questions of violence in state and society. But we need to consider the more general classical question of how violence is related to politics itself. In the tradition of sociological analysis, violence is understood as the distinctive means of politics. Max Weber writes the means, he writes that in italics. He, Weber, understands political authority as the legitimated capacity to govern a territory and all the people and goods in it. Political authority, in the form of this territorial state, monopolises the legitimate use of violence, and groups or parties become political authorities by achieving that monopolisation. This violence, or at least its threat, is used both for the enforcement of social order in the society and for the defence of the state against external forces. And in that framework, violence and politics are deeply intertwined. In constitutional democracies, governed by the rule of law and the procedures of electoral competition to secure the power to govern, competing parties compete exactly for the right to exercise and maintain the monopoly power over the legitimate uses of violence. So if it's okay to beat your wife, that is because, in effect, the government has said that it is okay. If the police turn a blind eye, then that is an exercise of political violence precisely because the state is determining what violence is and is not permitted. In other systems, that's in a democracy, in other systems, violence and force themselves are the central means by which parties and factions attempt to secure domination over state, society and territory. And in revolutionary traditions of thought and action, the very monopolisation of force by the state and the uses of state violence to maintain social order are set to legitimate, to necessitate violent action by those who challenge the police or the military, challenge the state. Where the competition is between social fractions, between competing social groups, religions or ethnicities, say, assertion of presence in public spaces and hence domination of the society can also be thought to lead inevitably to the exertion of physical force. And because this competition for dominance is a political competition, violence is the means of politics. That construction of political power and violence, though, the Max Weber one, is by no means uncontested. In an older tradition, associated in my understanding with Aristotle, political power is understood as public in its manifestation and premised on a process of conciliation of all the parties present in the public. And conciliation, crucially, just cannot be achieved by violence. Violence can achieve domination and oppression. Conciliation requires treatments without violence, and those include deliberation, debate, compromise, bargaining, agreement. Violence always tips a settlement into a state of domination. And this is the conception of politics that tends to dominate liberalism as a tradition of thought and philosophy, although we should note that liberal political philosophy can be criticised for overlooking the susceptibility of forms of conciliation to contamination by domination and violence. And I want to mention a third understanding of this critical relationship, and that's the one associated with Hannah Arendt, who takes a distinctive approach. For her, action in concert, acting together, the exertion of power in common to achieve a deliberate world is what's distinctive about politics as opposed to other forms of action. Action in concert allows constitutions to be made. It allows social orders to be maintained. In particular, acting together holds open the political world in which social and public life can go on. Power, in her vision, is antithetical to violence. Violence is instrumental, and exceedingly short-term instrumental at that. Violence uses weapons against others. It's always destructive. Power consists in effort to act, to use energy. It's wrong to think of our acting in pursuit of designated ends, according to Arendt, for that is too instrumental a way of putting it. The making of a world, a political society for us to live in, is an open-ended, endlessly creative project rather than designed or manufactured. According to Arendt, where violence is, politics is over, it's exhausted, it's defeated. Those who act violently are acting anti-politically. So we've got three rival versions of the relationship of politics and violence, and which one we promote, as I'm going to go on to argue, really matters, and it really matters for these projects of opposing forms of social violence like the ones that we're considering here. People do justify their uses of violence. They justify their uses of violence politically, and they justify social uses of violence, as many of you know when you hear men justifying wife beating, or rapists justifying rape, or prison officers justifying raping prisoners. We know that people can, as it were, engage in reasoned argument. In my current work, or one bit of my current work, my co-author Kim Hutchins from the London School of Economics and I are analysing accounts of the relationship of violence to politics in the canonical works of political theory. And in particular, we seek to understand how political thinkers and activists, whether they're on the side of the state or on the side of, as it were, society against the state, justify uses of violence and non-violence, whether on the part of states or within societies, or by, as I said, organised political actors against the state. Now, justifications are frequently instrumental. They're based on causal theories of the outcomes or the consequences of action. For many thinkers, violence is understood to be a bad thing, but its use can be justified by the good ends it serves. So arguments for going to war are frequently of that form. Now, there's a problem, of course, with that form of justification, and that is that the outcomes of violence are at best quite uncertain. Uncertainty about any good effects of violence and distrust of empiricist causal metaphysics has led many theorists to retreat from that kind of, well, if we do this, it's a bad thing, but it will be for good ends. They retreat from that kind of argument, and they value violence irrespective of its outcomes. I'm here thinking in particular of the tradition of French thought, from Georges Sorel to Frantz Fanon and on, where you find existential celebrations of either the transgressive and therefore productive uses of violence, and also you find associations between violence and cleansing. Of course, the late 20th century gave us many instances of this. Cleansing and hygiene, that it's the only way that the oppressed can rid themselves of the poison of oppression. So what we find in these kinds of arguments for violence is that thinkers run into the problems of instrumentalist consequential justifications and turn to aesthetic or virtue-based justifications. And that kind of shift from causal reasoning is mirrored, interestingly enough, in the arguments for non-violence that are made by pacifists. So pacifists do the same thing. They say, you know, only if we are peaceful will the outcomes be such and such. And then, of course, you realise that you can't really make that argument because of uncertainty. And you turn instead to an aesthetic argument about the meanings of violence or its symbolism. Sometimes pacifists emphasise the negative effects of violence, the harms to perpetrators as well as to victims in the form of trauma and mental and emotional damage, which they emphasise, and rightly in my view, is transmitted through networks and across generations. And they argue that those harms are so significant as to outweigh any possible good that might come of violent action. Of course, there's lots and lots of evidence, especially from the inheritance of the 19th and 20th centuries and the prospects of the 21st, with generations of damaged children, inadequately or badly parented by traumatised adults. And there's terrific evidence of the damage that cultures and contexts of violence do. But, on the other hand, in the face of the greater evil yet, as even Mahatma Gandhi admitted, the depredations of the Nazis as compared with the oppression and exploitation of the older European colonialisms and empires, non-violent action would have been hopelessly ineffective. But any such causal or consequential failure of non-violence doesn't affect non-violence's symbolic, aesthetic quality. In acting non-violently, according to those committed to non-violent action, one is asserting values, meanings of good, right, and beauty. And such assertions and statements are philosophically valid irrespective of their outcomes. Now, that work in this analysis of justifications of violence is historical and theoretical on my part, but it's significant for the thinking of participants in this conference in several ways. This conference and the wider political context of which it's a part itself marks a great progress that has been made in mainstreaming understandings of the wrongs of gender-based violence and constructing a response to those wrongs in human rights institutions. The institutionalisation of women's rights as human rights and of sexual and domestic violences as matters of public health and justice is both a terrific achievement and also the opening of a new stage in the struggle. Because of course this institutionalisation and the theory of gender and justice on which it's based are both strongly resisted by entrenched interests and ideological opponents. Global resolutions are insufficient to bring about social change. Law at the international or state level might be necessary, but is not sufficient. Change has to occur at the cultural, normative level, and the process of change has to be political. Social scientific research is one platform from which this political process can be pursued. Political organisation in civil society groups and in and against parties is another. But that takes us back to the need for clear and subtle thinking about gender, violence and politics. The politics of violence against women, which many people in this room are engaged in, obviously is in some tension with political action on gender-based violence. Feminist politics and feminist theory arises to deal with the claims of women to physical and social security. The language of women's rights the critiques of violence against women signal an analysis, a diagnosis, and also a political project of sexual equality and the liberation of women, and it is generally led by women for all kinds of reasons, but it's a women's project. However, as we're all aware, it can be politically and strategically expedient not to talk about that too loudly and to put the claims, put women's claims into the language of human rights, or to speak of domestic violence rather than violence against women or intimate partner abuse. So there are reasons to neutralise the sexual claims and the theory of gender, to which we need recourse if the mechanisms by which sexual inequality is entrenched and maintained helps us resolve the tension between those two strategies. There really is a tension, as numerous commentators have observed. Women's rights, violence against women, are categories that reflect the statistics. But statistics and probabilities are not all of reality. There's, on the one hand, violence against men, as in men's state settings, and I think we mustn't overlook that. But in this lecture, I particularly want to meditate too on women's violence, because that too is a phenomenon of human life. And there's a problem. The discourse of women's rights and violence against women can map gender too straightforwardly onto sex, equating femaleness with femininity, with subordination and a kind of pacifism or weakness. On the other hand, the discourse of human rights and domestic violence neutralises the statistical facts, turns our attention away from the critical materialist question, whom, which actually is Lenin's central political question, and eclipses the structure of sexual division in state and society. Both sex and gender are depoliticised in that human rights language. And we can find ourselves enmeshed, as I know many of you are aware, in discourses of the symmetry of domestic and sexual violence, which effectively degenders violence. Either that, or we focus on the implicatedness of all parties to violent relationships in their continuation, distributing responsibility to victims as much as to perpetrators. So it's all a bind. The appropriate political response to those political moves, I argue, cannot be to rely wholly or even primarily on quantitative claims, no matter how striking in any context the data are. There's nothing to be gained by denying that women are violent, or denying that their violence matters. But there is a difficulty with the normative and theoretical understanding of women's violence. In terms of the binary gender system that associates men with aggression and women with nurture, women's violence is pathological. It's a violation of nurturing maternal practice. Alternatively, our theory of gender can insist that masculine and feminine traits are not divided clearly between males and females perfectly, but rather are shared. Then, women's violence might be thought of as a sign of women's participation in masculine identity, in exactly the same way that men can be feminine or can participate in feminine, for example, maternal practice when they're caring for young children. But obviously there's a drawback to that move, still, because it still associates masculinity with violence and femininity with non-violence, and it makes of women's violence a masculine matter, a masculine phenomenon. Both those sociological moves, both those theoretical moves are socially common. For instance, women's violence has often been punished more severely than men's by criminal courts. Women who are associated, so a woman who engaged in a violent crime, for example, both has committed the violent crime, but she's also worse because she's deviant. So the pathology adds to her guilt. Women who are associated with so-called masculine characteristics, such as public authority, like being a head of state, for example, or a soldier, are accused of acting like men. So the wrong of their violence is compounded again by the deviance of their gender or sexuality. Now, we need the concept of gender and the idea of the sex-gender system if we're to understand how phenomena like rape in war or domestic abuse in the context of marriage operate, but any binary model of gender leaves us in a conceptual and explanatory bind when it comes to the understanding of and responses to practices that escape gender norms. Now, in my view, our theoretical task is to drop the binary model of gender and trace instead the forms of masculinity and femininity that are possible, that are endorsed or enjoined, and that are proscribed or prescribed. It's important to analyse, for all these forms, their relationships on the one hand to the dominant constructions of biological femaleness and maleness in the context, and on the other hand, their relationship to dominant in the context norms of masculinity and femininity. They might be based on patriarchy, or they might be based on liberal equality, but in any public political culture, you've got some dominating story about the differences between masculine and feminine, and about the differences that maleness and femaleness make to a human life. Now, our expectation, of course, is that dominant norms won't be uncontested. I mean, for one thing, there's all us lot, right, contesting them and complaining about them, but neither will they be unambiguous. We expect that in any dominant story there are going to be tensions and probably contradictions. We certainly expect that there will be variations on what counts as properly feminine conduct according to your social class or your status or your ethnicity. For many individuals, their own experience of being a man or being a woman will be in negotiation with the norms of which they are aware and that they feel themselves subject to or judged by. Rather than beginning from a binary scheme of sex and gender, and consequently finding deviance or compliance, confirmation or confusion, we, social researchers, should acknowledge that societies, cultures, politics, psychological contingency and circumstance allow many negotiations with sexual and gender options that face us. Of course, in research, we're going to find accounts of binary sex-gender schemes, and we're going to see the enforcement of them in daily institutions, like men's and ladies' toilets, for example. We can hardly escape, right, being either a man or a woman in any building like this one. But those are discoveries. They are the upshot of social science and of course daily life. They're not presuppositions, or they should not be presuppositions or a priori frameworks for our analysis. We must, in short, seek an understanding of how forms of violence intersect with and interact with forms of femininity and forms of masculinity, and with other social categories such as class and status. Only by way of such theoretical inquiry, together with measurement, can we begin to understand the causes and consequences of violent practices. Now, let us be clear that this programme is very different from the older programmes of empirical social research, which managed somehow to simultaneously normalise, rationalise, and also ignore sex differences and inequalities. This understanding of gender possibilities and the critique of distributions and patterns is political at the outset. That is to say, this social theory sees violence as embedded in the sex-gender order and as constitutive of that order. Feminist organisation in opposition to established norms and rates of violence against women, and in pursuit of redistributions of power and reconstruction of structures, has to face the matters of political strategy and tactics. And this means that feminism must consider the question of its own relationship to state power and state violence. There are good ethical reasons to be sceptical of arguments, whether they're made by governments or social actors, that the good aims of or outcomes of violence can justify it, can make it a bad but justifiable end to a good enough means. For, as I've remarked, the outcomes of violence are never certain in advance, and anyway, we surely know enough about the intergenerational transmission of trauma to understand that its effects ramify through space and across time. We need to focus not on what violence is for or what it does, that is, not on instrumental reasoning. Ethically and politically, we must focus on what violence is. What in particular is involved when a person enters into a practice of violence, whether that is hitting their child or raping a prisoner or beating up a migrant. What work has to be done to the self as an agent in order to engage in that kind of action vis-a-vis another person? What's involved for them themselves, as well as for the network of relationships in which they are enmeshed, and of course, as well as for the victim? Only such a truly sociological focus can guide us in political action. I believe that such a sociological focus, such a critical approach to practices of violence, ethically justifies a political stance that takes non-violence to be the default and turns our political energies to dismantling structures of violence wherever they rule men's and women's lives. Thank you.